questions you have into the chat, and we'll be happy to sort of address those towards the end, and hopefully have a little bit of a discussion around, what does access mean when it's being mediated through digital means, because it definitely complicates that scenario. So again, the overall presentation is about the role of digital in access to secondary education in the Asia-Pacific region. The agenda is relatively straightforward. It's basically in 3 parts. Past intersection of tech, schools, and access. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's been tried before and how that sort of frames the conversation, particularly as we got into part 2, which is this, this COVID period that we're all sort of living through, and how that's complicated the notion of access to schools, period, let alone secondary schools. And then the idea of the future, what implications for access, agency, next steps, and hopefully at that point it becomes a slightly more micro level kind of discussion about, practical action that schools or secondary schools can take, or past experiences that have produced some results that have implications for access. So that's the basic structure. The premise that I'm advancing here, maybe one of the, the understatements of the year, is the idea that access is really complicated. Access alone, being mediated even without digital means, is a very complicated issue. If you include the digital, the technology, and all the brokers of said technology, then that becomes even more complicated. So the idea of access is not a binary, as we know in this project, we know that. But the idea of access being a very, very complicated, very, very nuanced thing is paramount in everything I talk about. So technology in and of itself does nothing, and I think that's important to sort of establish that at the onset. This is not some sort of fix. It won't necessarily correct social inequality. It won't correct urban-rural divides. It won't correct gender differentials and access to education. It won't correct all those things, and in many cases, it'll exacerbate those things and make them worse. So that idea is important to have in the onset. So technology in and of itself is really not the critical factor. It's just, as I just said, it's just as likely to accelerate, amplify, or reinforce a divide as mitigate one. And we've seen this quite starkly in this COVID time. A lot of these divides are multiplied in many cases. So language matters a great deal in how this is all framed, and I think a lot of my presentation will talk about that. The sort of the framing of it in terms of the rhetoric around access and digital, all of this matters a great deal, and we've seen a shift in how that language is being presented, so that's important, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Technology acquisition without teacher community training and engagement is a waste of resource, and I think that's true the world over. This idea of tech for tech's sake, or the digital strictly because it's, it's the trend or anything like that, is very, very problematic. So anytime you hear a tech acquisition model or a project or a government expenditure in the region dedicated to tech acquisition without parallel streams of activity around teacher training or community engagement, you should look at it with a degree of skepticism. Again, I'm going to refer to this work from Carrie Facer and Neil Selwyn throughout this presentation because I think it was very, very instructive for the period that we're living through now. And it's the digital technology and the futures of education moving towards a non-stupid optimism. This idea that we needn't lose our senses when we're talking about tech and how it sort of engages with the idea of access. And ultimately to understand that digital technology alone does not transform education. And in fact, the essence of traditional education forms remain intact, even despite all these COVID maneuvers and movements online, in some cases not online, that to retain that focus on the fact that, education is education, and these structures of education will remain in many cases intact, not in all cases though. So going into part 1, past intersections of technology, schools, and access. And it's sort of framed, the picture sort of suggests that this is framed largely as an infrastructural question, at least it was at the time, and in many cases it still is. So tech ownership and use, I'm not going to recite statistics in this presentation, but just to note that throughout the world, let alone in the Asia Pacific region, there is a relatively stark divide between around what percentage of households with computer or internet access at home. It's still very, very minimal the world over, and there's clearly stark divides in rural, urban populations, things of that nature. So this general trend towards access and connectivity in the home is still quite the ongoing process, and in many cases, it's more or less plateaued. So 2020 found us in this weird space, obviously, with COVID, and for the first time in recorded data, we were seeing these measures go down. The idea of, particularly mobile connectivity, this idea that mobile, which is the technology, the digital technology of greatest penetration the world over, the vast majority of internet traffic takes place via mobile, and especially so in some of the populations that we're working with and focusing on in this project. So it's important to note that that's declining, and a lot of that has to do, obviously, with economic constraints in and around the COVID lockdowns and things of that nature. So we're seeing actually a decline in the rate of mobile subscriptions, which is, it's a problematic trend, but perhaps one that was fairly predictable. So that access mechanism is becoming a little bit more complicated than what it was before. And wildly uneven, I think, is the way to frame this. This is all very macro, and so to focus on these broader issues first. So that internet penetration by region is wildly diverse. You can see it there, and in many other regions, it's a little bit more so than that, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So, but in Asia, throughout the Asia Pacific region, you're seeing some wild divergence in terms of internet access, however defined. So you'll note that a lot of these reports, a lot of this data has different ideas of what internet access is and how it's defined. But we assume that if digital education or the digital is to impact access at secondary schools in the Asia Pacific region, then one needs to engage with the idea of internet penetration overall. And this is especially true in terms of the countries that are represented in this project. So we're looking at Laos and the Philippines, Papua New Guinea. We're talking in Bangladesh, for example, and we see that the internet penetration is sporadic. It's increasing generally across the board, but it is slow, and it's certainly not anywhere near any sort of saturation in terms of the population, right? So this is still very much a privileged position to have internet access in many of these countries. You can see some that are approaching some sort of majority, which is quite good. And in the case of some, they have exceeded that majority. That the majority of the population, in some way, has internet access, however defined. But most of that is largely through the mobile subscriptions, the cellular connections, these sorts of things. Not something we would traditionally associate with schools' ICT or digital access. So I do recommend, if you're interested in this sort of data, this datareportal.com, it's producing reports sort of drawn together from all sorts of data sources as well. And they do give fairly good snapshots of what the access situation looks like throughout the region in most countries in the world. Okay, so that was just setting it up. So we're largely in a space that's wildly uneven in terms of access, in terms of ICT ownership. And this is before we even get to the question of secondary schools access. What kind of infrastructure that they have to support that is very diverse as well. So this is very much macro kind of level discussions. But we should, at this point, sort of switch our gears a little bit and focus on what are these past intersections between tech and education. They've been ongoing for quite some time. Often it's difficult to pinpoint exactly when this was happening. You could probably go back to correspondence schools and things of this nature if you're trying to get the full historical trend of the intersection of what would be called in analog technology and education. But I mean, we're focusing on the digital. We're really speaking about the probably last 15, 20 years or so. So some of these are still around. Some of these are highly contested and controversial, and some are still making the same mistakes that we made 15 years ago. The first being, well, I'm not saying they're making a mistake, one laptop per child, which was I think we're all familiar with it. One laptop per child ran throughout the Asia Pacific region, throughout Africa, Latin America, etc. And it was a truly ambitious effort. It did do a few things that I think we are all taking away from it as being, worthwhile in terms of carrying that forward into future digital projects around access. And it did some things that we potentially might want to critique a little bit more carefully. And that the last two bullet points are my own. So ultimately, one laptop per child being an ambitious effort, it ushered in this era of solutionism, this idea that tech can, quote unquote, fix the problems, the underlying issues that sort of have plagued access in these particular contexts, which is with us to this day, still very, very prevalent, and it's very, very problematic at the same time too. So solutionism, the idea that tech can fix societal issues, the underlying issues of access in society. And importantly, it's echoed. A lot of this solutionism is being echoed in policy and strategy, and I'll talk about that in a brief bit. The other model that is becoming increasingly contested, thankfully, is this idea of these academy in a box models. The most prevalent example of this would be Bridge International Academies, for example. These low-cost schooling in regions where access to schools, secondary schools included, is problematic. If you're not familiar with this, it's a vertically integrated system. It's very, very much a factory assembly model of education. Everything is pre-programmed and it's delivered. Everything is pre-programmed, I should say, at corporate headquarters for this particular one, but the model is similar across all of them. And they each reach out, and all this content is spewed out essentially to the schools in these regions, which is read out verbatim from word for word to students by unqualified staff, referred to as learning facilitators. You'll notice that's a trend in a lot of this as well, is not calling teachers teachers. Is the idea that teaching or teachers is largely inconsequential to the model. So that's something that you'll see again and again, not just in this region, but worldwide in any sort of engagement with educational technology. So these models are characterized by tech dependency, focus on measures of scale and efficiency. So this idea of scale, this idea of efficiency, that the problem with education, the problem with access to education is the inefficiency, the messiness of the model. So these are solutionist to the nth degree, and they are largely tech dependent. So the tech is really integral to the system, i.e. it can't be done without it, which is obviously problematic as well. So it's essentially a teach by numbers sort of approach, and it's run into a host of issues in some of the countries that have attempted to do it. Mostly to do, rightly so from teachers' unions who see this as a commercial play on the public good of education. Those organizations listed there have all written a formal proposal to not allow these sorts of things to happen in their respective countries. And you've seen many countries start to expunge this idea of low-cost schooling, but that's a model that's been advanced and it captures the imagination, which I'll come to in a second. It's important. The third is largely this tech drop, this idea that you can just drop tech into a space and the connectivity alone will produce significant outcomes, which we know not necessarily to be true. And there's many of these models. There's Samsung had a model of this. BRIC, which is an East African organization, created this kit in a box. I think they're called Kio kits. It's this idea of tablets in a box, sturdy, with a receiver, instant connectivity, and then they charge in the box themselves. And so this idea that you can present the technology, there's no training mechanism attached to this. They don't see that's not their purview necessarily, but people who have purchased these kits, it's problematic for those very reasons, is that there's not this kind of parallel stream of training or an understanding of even the local context of how these things would insert themselves into the local context. Importantly, though, it's how it's repositioning the idea of education overall. It's access framed not as a school teacher access, so it's not this idea that the students are accessing the school, the community of learners, and the professional teacher, but it's this idea of technology, internet content access. The idea of education is meaningful access to content as opposed to instruction. They're not binaries necessarily, but it's reframing that discussion of access considerably. Now, what we do is we sort of position all of these as the imaginaries of educational technology. It's something we do quite a bit in our center, is this idea of what imaginary of education is being advanced in these models, in these one laptop per child models, in these academies in a box or kits in a box, all that kind of thing. What are the imaginaries of educational technology and access being advanced here? I think it's increasingly framing the discussion of access. That's important. I'll show you how it's framing this discussion. There's massive investments on the end of these imaginaries. So I think the models that are being advanced from the commercial sector, from the educational technology sector, are increasingly framing our idea of what access is and what education could be in this very near future. And there's a nexus of non-educational actors increasingly bound in educational decision making. Very, very important point is that increasingly, although we would argue this has always been the case to some degree, that there were non-educational actors making educational decisions. That's fine, that's been going on for quite some time. But there's an increasing array of non-educational actors with very, very little commitment to what the understanding of education might be, depending on the context, as a public good or as a sort of an employment assembly line. Again, those aren't necessarily binaries. They can exist on a spectrum, but these imaginaries are framing that idea of who makes decisions about what education is and what access is, really. So it's linked to the SDGs. I mean, I think this is important to note, is that all of this is linked to the SDGs. This is a nexus of interrelated facets or concepts or policy or strategy or social norms. All of that is increasingly bound in a nexus that is sort of stimulating what we're seeing more and more, and which certainly COVID put into the highest gear possible. So again, it's linked to this idea of scale and access. We can scale this. We can the idea of access can be scaled, consistent with the sort of the targets for the SDGs. So there's a policy pressure sort of intersection here. The policy pressure, the third-party servicing of targets, largely commercial, and this language around technology is picked up in national policy and strategy. It's not specific necessarily. SDG 4, which is the one we tend to focus on in education, is not specific to the ICT being the vehicle for this, but SDG 9 certainly picks it up. It's this idea to significantly increase access to ICTs and strive to provide universal and affordable access to the internet by 2020, which I don't think I'm safe to say we did not hit that mark. But either way, the idea of this being picked up, the language of access and inclusion and scale are being picked up in the SDGs as well. And it's mirrored in the targets and goals. So now while SDG 4 doesn't necessarily spend a lot of time with the ICTs themselves, the Education 2030 does. It does sort of elaborate on some of the metrics and the points from SDG 4. And in Education 2030, these goals are very, very explicit about what access looks like, what educational inclusion looks like as well. So it's about providing distance learning, ICT training, et cetera, those normal things that we would see. Providing teachers with adequate technological skills to manage ICT and social networks and these sorts of things. Okay, so teacher training, which is positive. And the third point about information ICTs must be harnessed to strengthen educational systems, knowledge dissemination, et cetera, et cetera. So to talk about quality and effective learning and more effective service provision. So you're starting to see the language of access, and you're starting to see the language of, again, this idea of efficiency and scale, that we can, ICTs can make this all a very predictable process, which is perhaps possible to some degree, but it's problematic in others. It's just something to note that the language shifts a little bit in some of these documents. And then it's echoed a little bit further into policy, strategy, notes, reports, etc. So you see this cascading idea of access being equated with technology, with ICTs beginning to sort of echo beyond their the initial kind of space that it was residing in. And I'm not to pick on the Asian Development Bank, because I think it's actually a relatively good project, but they're mirroring some of this language. Note, so this is about COVID specifically. So what is the response to COVID in the region around education? And it's number one. So the question of access becomes a question of sustaining or continuity. This idea that we can sustain or we can provide a degree of continuity in access in schools throughout the region. So that language changes a little bit, which has implications for what tech is looked at for this. Recovery, what's this idea of make up for lost time, transition to higher levels of education, these sorts of things. So the language is changing, this idea of maintaining, making up, transitioning, as opposed to what we would more traditionally associate with access. And this idea of rejuvenation, we can rejuvenate teaching and learning with new tools and techniques. Yes, which is certainly possible, but rarely achieved. So the idea of the language changing a little bit is echoed further and further. And again, I'm just picking up on the Asian Development Bank here, recent project that they have, recent report that they had there. It's codified in recommendations, priorities, and targets. So you can see the language cascade from this idea of the SDGs all the way through, and certainly being accelerated under COVID. And in fact, COVID is changing a little bit of the language in terms of uninterrupted. You can see in the first point there, it's uninterrupted access. So continuity becomes a key measure of access. Revamp teacher training, support teachers to cope with the requirements in new learning environments. Okay, and so digital content, again, it's this emphasis on content, often at the expense of human instruction or teachers as the focal point of that education, or these sorts of things. So you see this shift into ideas of content. Equal learning opportunities, okay. Assessments and examinations, which is, I highlighted assessments and examinations because that's really where the contentious end of educational technology is often poised. And you see a lot of this around, the idea of proctoring, remote proctoring solutions and things of that nature. So the idea of assessments, examinations, accreditations and things of that nature are very important. And again, they're explicit in scaling up deployment of new technologies to improve learning. So again, it's not to improve education, it's to improve learning. That's an important distinction there too. But you're scaling up the deployment of these sorts of things to improve education overall. Now, this is what one might argue is the biggest driver of all this, is the commercial aspects of it that is being engendered to treat these targets, to address these access issues, and it's a monster. I mean, there's no way to get around it. The growth of this industry, particularly during COVID, but it was well underway before COVID. It's tripling and in many cases quadrupling over a very, very short span of time. That's equally true in the APAC region. And your major players in that space are, North America, the normal cast of characters in the UK and EU, and China. This is very much the biggest, or soon to be the biggest player in educational technology overall. So this is what I was referring to earlier, is that these organizations, these commercial organizations, increasingly have a say in how we're structuring education, increasingly have a say in how we're engaging with the SDGs or engaging with these Education 2030 targets. They're very much a factor in this, because most domestic populations do not have this capacity to scale and this capacity to address some of the educational challenges they have. I would argue the commercial spaces don't either, but they're just a very, very visible member actor in this landscape. The last point is mine. That's a little editorial there, but each carries with it a particular imaginary of education, many of which we may or may not share. Each makes a certain kind of pedagogy possible. To understand that technology co-structures pedagogy is an important point in all of this as well. So what are these imaginaries? I think some of the imaginaries that we're talking, when I say imaginaries, are these narratives of how EdTech could be used to improve education, improve access throughout the region. And some of the more emblematic ones are things like this. So for example, this is IBM 5 and 5. This is, in 5 years, what 5 things will happen sort of thing. And they routinely publish these, pretty easy to find. In this imaginary, the classroom becomes the proxy for the teacher, and we're talking about a smart classroom complete with these devices, connectivity to content, largely devoid of any teaching whatsoever. So there is no real mention of a teacher at all in this imaginary of education, which on the surface of it might seem it's simply an advertising scheme or a marketing ploy of some sort. It's not, because what it's seeing as the student, it's seeing the student or the family as being the consumer, not the schools, not the teacher. So it's in essence, it's bypassing a little bit the school structure. Another is some of the more, well, I think I can safely call it academically, a little bit more bonkers type educational technology. These are the imaginaries of EdTech, that EdTech or education becomes really about behavioral shifts. I have a colleague there in the center, Ben Williamson, is talking about this idea of social emotional learning and the solution to workforce automation, et cetera. So you're starting to see more about emotion detection research and technology. It sounds like science fiction, but it's very much with us. And many organizations, many nations perhaps, would be more inclined than others to sort of engage with this sort of technology. So the purpose of education shifts into a more social emotional learning, i.e., behavioral change becomes the purpose of education. Not something everybody would want. China, this isn't specific to China because there are experiments with AI education throughout the world, UK included. So there are many Asia-Pacific actors as well working in this space. So this idea, we've had massive kind of experimentation with AI education. So the AI is being used to personalize learning direct to the student, again, bypassing the idea of the teacher and the schools. What we would sort of associate with the true access, what we've traditionally associated with access via access to schools is largely being redefined to some degree as access to personalized content and activity, in which AI is meant to facilitate. You see some more about the social engineering aspects. Again, this is from China, but this is not specific to China. Every country has some minor experimentation with this, and it's this idea of using data to, provide scores essentially. So you're ranked just as we would do with educational data in some respects, and standardized assessments and this sort of thing. They do as well with an overall score of a series of metrics used to give an overall number. For each and every student would have a number ranking them according to what is seen as beneficial, what's seen as the priority of education. And we do this now, but with the technology, it's just becoming accelerated. And it's becoming a little bit more obfuscated. We don't always know what metrics are informing these different devices, these different scores. And it's important to note that the technology is engaging, embedding itself, really, I should say, in all walks of life. So how we define access to anything, really, in the region and throughout the world is becoming more and more a question of digital inclusion, digital access. This idea, all of this right here focuses on biometric data for refugees to give access to via UNHCR, to give access through, to education or financial services or, legal services, things of that nature. So the digital becomes the mechanism by which particularly, more marginalized segments of our population are accessing what's available to them. Which carries with it obviously some complications. Okay, so going back to the Facer and the Selwyn point is that digital technology does not improve learning. This might sound a little bit strange for somebody who is a lecturer in digital education to sort of say this, but there's little robust evidence that suggests technology used to any sort of sustained improvements in learning independent of the teacher and other contextual effects. So ultimately, it still rests on the quality of education provided by the teacher. So anybody who's tried to do it, at least on a scale, you can find this in individual research studies, some improvement here or there, but it's very difficult to describe it or just explain it away from the context, not the technology. So this idea of technology can improve learning, it's sort of become, associated with improved learning, is just not found. It's just not found in the research. So it's important to note. So that takes us all the way up to the present. And the chaotic present, acceleration and access. So what's changed essentially? I'm sure we're all sick of talking about COVID, but it's still with us and it's still changing the fundamental nature of how people access education. So let's talk a little bit about it. I don't need to spend too much detail here about COVID, I don't think, but the closures and the interruptions were, shared throughout the Asia Pacific region. They were shared globally, but with different degrees. I don't think it's useful to sort of paint this in one brush and say that access was interrupted in the same way for all parties involved. It was not. So there are unique differences amongst the nations and the regions and the rural urban populations and amongst particular demographics in these regions in terms of access to secondary education. Adjustments needed to be made, and ultimately what we're seeing, I think above all else, and people could argue against this, but the idea of amplifying divides. These divides that we experienced before COVID, not just in terms of digital, but in terms of educational access, what educational divide exists, what rural-urban divide exists, these are being amplified to some degree. And that's largely to do with people being out of school. I'm not sure why I had a little animation there, kind of neat. But out of school, so obviously a large degree of the student population, the secondary student population in these regions, in these countries, are out of school or have been out of school or are continuing to be out of school. So the idea of access, the physical co-location to the school, very problematic. Now, in response to that access to school, we're talking about access to a physical location being curtailed for all. You start to look towards the infrastructure to see what mechanisms for access exist. It's a natural sort of reaction to the pandemic. And we see great divides, obviously, in terms of tech acquisition and use. We see great divides in terms of connectivity and vast urban-rural divides as well. And now we'll talk a little bit about, there's some measures, regions or schools can take to begin to overcome some of those barriers, but the barriers to access are significant. And the mobile to laptop issue is something we'll talk about a little bit going forward. Even if the technology, however minimal, is in place, for example, a student might have access to a mobile device, a student might have access to, if they're extraordinarily lucky, like a learning center or some ICT of some sort, it's still problematic. There's very little configuration that can be done, even in the most cleverly designed educational program, sort of engaging with digital, it still has serious shortcomings in terms of access. That only 12% of households in least developed countries have internet access at home. We knew that before. Even low technology approaches cannot ensure learning connectivity. So in this case, I'm pointing to, which is a relatively famous example during COVID. It was a site, and this is Iran, so it's not necessarily the region we're talking about, but I think it's instructive here is this idea that students, on a national level, it was dictated that, school would be remote, learning would take place online, connectivity became a premium. But the idea of infrastructure to support that connectivity, even if the technology was, the student was in possession of the technology, the infrastructure around that connectivity, very problematic. So this idea that students would go to, high into the mountains and to the hills to try to get the best signal to relay their homework or relay their activity was relatively common. I mean, this happened the world over, but again, it's important to note that really this is about reframing this as continuity. How can we continue to provide access to education with this incredible new barrier that took place in terms of COVID? So you're seeing a great deal, and I think there's some promise to this approach. You're seeing a great deal of these public-private partnerships in terms of schools' access, in sort of establishing access to schools and universities and all levels of schooling, really. And it revealed significant divides in the connectivity, ownership, and use of technology that we knew. I don't think that was too surprising. Public-private partnerships via schools, telecoms, and governments. So many of the countries in the Asia-Pacific region and throughout sub-Saharan Africa, for example, I work with other universities there that did this. It's this idea of working with the mobile telecoms in particular, the mobile telecommunication, the local carrier within these regions to establish access to a particular, for example, IP range. And that IP range might be some centralized learning management system with the school content on it, this sort of thing. So you establish this protected IP essentially, and it's free. So it would be free to access, so the students wouldn't incur, cost in terms of data. It's a pretty common, increasingly common model, I should say. And you saw quite a bit of this activity immediately in response to COVID. So if we can't, for example, we can't do much about the ownership issue, and that's a point I had there as well. This doesn't solve the tech ownership issue, but it might help alleviate some of the barriers surrounding the connectivity issue. And this would be through cellular data as opposed to, broadband or, Wi-Fi signal of any sort, which is actually in many cases much stronger than Wi-Fi or broadband. It's problematic in terms of, again, it's opening education up to non-educational actors. I mean, the mobile telecoms aren't doing this necessarily out of goodwill. They see opportunity here, and perhaps that's a confluence that needs to be accepted, or maybe not. It just depends. But it's important to have scrutiny on these relationships as well. But this has happened quite a bit. I think the most problematic one that existed well before COVID is mentioned there as well. It's the Internet Foundation created off of Facebook with this idea of zero-rated services and things of that nature, that some connection to particular websites would be free of charge for anybody accessing it in these countries. It's generally referred to as zero-rated. That is problematic in many, many respects in terms of developing a local infrastructure, in terms of developing a local competitive space where services can be developed and deployed. And it does complicate the notion of access to secondary schools as well. So, but you saw quite a bit of this activity taking place at this time. So ultimately, during COVID, there's this idea of interruptions and rethinking process. And this didn't take place uniformly. Asia Pacific is just much too big a place to make any sweeping generalizations about what happened or what didn't happen. But ultimately, we're seeing more and more this position of, okay, if tech ownership is problematic, if students or families that these students are coming from, if they do not have home ownership of technology, which is very often the case, and I would probably argue the vast majority of the cases, then where does the connectivity take place? Where does access get mediated through the digital? Access to schools, I should say. So then schools become these sites of connection. The idea of tech potentially in the classrooms or on campus or on the space somewhere is increasingly looked at. And again, the schools become sites of connectivity. I'm not sure why I put that twice, but I'm sure it was really profound in my head. The necessity of co-location. So why this is problematic, and maybe this is an aberration, the COVID issue. Maybe this is a once in 100 years kind of issue, we hope. But the necessity of co-location is still problematic. So the idea of tech in the schools doesn't do anything for the COVID situation where co-location became a liability. So that complicates the access issue considerably. Well, it definitely complicates the ability of tech to address the access issue quite readily. So that's an important thing to note. And there's, again, a very general lack of teacher training with some very obvious exceptions. Some countries have made, well, I said not countries generally, but it's usually regions or specific districts have made consistent efforts to train their teachers, but it's very rare in terms of budgeting in particular. So suggesting and emphasizing access to content as key to quality secondary education. Again, it's the idea of you're accessing quality content, learning content, as opposed to quality instruction. Again, you would hope the teacher is using that content in sort of a pedagogically generative way, but that's not how the language is being framed necessarily. Okay, that took us all the way up. So that was a big sweeping reference to the situation as I understood it to be in the Asia Pacific region around access via digital means. So what future models are working here and what alternatives exist? What can be done or what is being done in the region around this? So I want to start here for a second and just start with a quote. Again, I'm referring to Carrie Facer because her work is largely very influential around the ideas of futures, approaches to education. What is the future? How would you prepare for the future? These sorts of things. And the quote is instructive, I think, because the idea of the future as a singular, inevitable trajectory in the face of which educators and citizens have no agency is subject to critique. The mere fact is that educators, systems, schools, regions even have agency in this process. And the academics in the room can challenge my presentation of what agency is there and what agency is even possible in this context. But there is agency to understand what our future of access to secondary schools in the region is, what imaginaries will drive that narrative of access as well. And it generally involves, when it's done particularly well, it clearly, I mean, I'm biased here because as a teacher, I've been a lifelong teacher and working in education. The idea of training teachers should be first and foremost in the space, before the tech even, and to some degree too. I mean, often you need the tech in front of you to experiment, play, adapt, reflect, evaluate, these sorts of things that would inform praxis. But this idea of training teachers needs to be a part of it. It needs to be, you can see it echoed in some of the, the more international instruments like, the PISA language and things like that. It's this idea of training teachers to localize, to localize towards contextually relevant pedagogy. So you see the OER Asia had the TESA project, had its problems as well. But, there are models here that can be instructive in how we work with teachers to define the pedagogy themselves when influenced by the digital. So I think that's important. And it might seem like I'm putting the cart before the horse on that in terms of emphasizing pedagogy before access or connectivity is even established. But it's important to put that at the foreground because that's often not included in budgets. Again, the pedagogy changes. So education at its core, this is the World Bank group of all people, of all organizations. So education at its core is a social endeavor and teachers must be empowered to use technologies to engage students in learning. The part that I wanted to emphasize towards the end, parents and caregivers become an essential point of engagement with students. And I think that should be sort of cascading through a lot of this language and a lot of our understandings of what access is. That this is ultimately a community-driven effort, and parents and caregivers, families overall, become an important instrument of access in these regions, whether it be through ICT or not. And I think that's an important thing to echo in whatever we're talking about there, that any engagement with technology at the school level potentially should have a parallel engagement with communities, caregivers, families at a more grassroots level as well. So I think both of these work together. But in this language, you can see the emphasis really changes a little bit, that about empowering teachers, which is refreshing to some degree, because a lot of the commercial language is not about this at all. So going forward, what else can we do? I think these ongoing public-private partnerships need to be, research critiqued, understood for what they are and what implications they have for how education is being structured. But they should still be engaged with as a mechanism for access via digital means. Often I almost, during the COVID period when we were working to establish access at this university even, I was frustrated by, the lack of parallel activity similar to this, even in, in our own, in the UK, in higher education in the UK. I was wanting to learn from the models that I've been working with in Africa and Asia. And so these ideas of public-private partnerships become a very pronounced thing, and we should look into these further. Connectivity, and that really means connectivity across the range of the technological spectrum. It's not a binary, so I think access via digital to schools is not a binary. We shouldn't view it as being Wi-Fi or radio or anything like that. These are infrastructure. It's an ecosystem of technology that presents itself. And how you daisy chain these, how you string these together in a meaningful way becomes the critical bit. But they're available in many cases. So you can daisy chain these accessible technologies. You can offload particular types of educational activity into particular technological spaces. Radio, for example, would be better at doing certain things other than others, and TV. So you can daisy chain these together in some meaningful way. It's important to note, even with this, there's still divides in this. There's still going to be people who will struggle to access any of these, let alone a spectrum of them. Mobile first, and this is something that I think the mobile for development people and the mobile education people have been sort of, screaming about for 15, 20 years, but it's this idea that mobile first, the vast majority of internet traffic in the world today is mobile. It originates in mobile, and most of the internet is not designed for mobile. So that's slowly changing, but it's important to note you design for mobile, and it's strongest with very specific educational activities, right? So the idea of literacy, numeracy, supplemental instruction to what's taking place in the classroom. I think there you start to have a much more nuanced view of what access to education looks like if you're seeing mobile position, or if you're seeing technology position in a very particular way to supplement classroom instruction or supplement educational activity. It has to be linked to broader efforts around digital inclusion. I'll talk about that in a second. And the data costs are a big issue. So you're going to look for offsets like those public-private partnerships I was just discussing. But the data costs do become a very problematic issue if you're engaging more and more with mobile. Another model that won't scale, I think you'll find with most of these that they don't scale. These are very contextually specific activities or initiatives to sort of establish access in some way. Community networks are literally just that. They're community-owned and operated internet networks where the community themselves build it, run it, and dole out access to it. It becomes a self-sustaining model to some degree, and in some cases, you haven't seen a lot of this activity, but in some cases, viewing the school as the community network is potentially a generative kind of approach. Is the idea that the community is reinforcing the school as being a node in the larger community, and all the way down to access, as the schools provide their own access to some degree. And there's a lot of activity taking place vis-a-vis the Internet Society throughout the world. The example in the lower right-hand corner is from Nepal, where you see these are relatively common approaches. And I think it's the idea, not to get too complicated in terms of what the digital setup is this idea of that there are alternative access and connectivity. Do you need perpetual connectivity to have a digital education approach to access? The answer is no, not necessarily, and I'll have another one on the next slide too as well. But you have this idea of mesh networks, peer-to-peer networks. You're stretching the network. In a mesh network, essentially, almost every dumb phone, a non-smartphone in the world will have the capacity to mesh into a network of what essentially, if you want to view it this way, the easiest way to view it would be like a Bluetooth connection. So if one person in the network has connectivity, they all do. This depends on, these can be set up, they take a little bit of time to set up, and there are some applications that allow for this, but it's this idea that one device is the node, and that's the one connecting. And everything else is farmed out through Bluetooth networks to students, to other classrooms, to the larger community. The only issue with such an approach is obviously the physical co-location thing. It needs a population density. So this is problematic a little bit in rural populations where people aren't close enough together to maximize these connections, but there should be exploration about connectivity in this way, looking for alternatives using very, very available technology. It's important to note that most technology has this capacity. This is not something you need to add in or add on to. And I'm going to embarrass somebody, I think, who's on the call right now. I think it's JJ Miranda. I'm going to embarrass him because he introduced me to this one, which is sort of a continuation of what I was just talking about in terms of these kind of using one device as a node. So JJ and I, based on his recommendation, are using this for another project on refugee education in Uganda. And it's basically an online-offline hybrid. So Calibri, you can use that link to go and test it out and experiment with it. It's open, it's free. But it's this idea that one device, say for example, you have X number of computers in a learning center in a school, if you're lucky enough to have the technology, one device acts as the server. And that server downloads all the content that is necessary to download, maybe at an interval, at a time that the Wi-Fi connectivity is a little bit stronger, on a weekend perhaps, or late on a Friday or something like that. And it downloads all the content and it farms it out to the different devices in the network, i.e. via in the local area network within the learning center or at the school. So all the devices will have access to the content without needing access to Wi-Fi. So you see a mechanism there that allows for some connectivity to take place, access to content. Again, I want to be wary of using the content term too much because I think its instruction is a little bit more important here. But the access to the content, at least, is being established to some degree via these means. So those are promising, very, very promising, and hopefully much more widely adopted approaches to connectivity and approaches to access to education. And it's also very, Calibri in particular, there are others in that kind of same genre, but Calibri in particular has access to all sorts of open educational resources created by other organizations, or even in some cases within the region, that students can access and teachers can pull down and download and make available for their students, regardless of connectivity. Okay, so sustainability is a big issue, though. I think it's important when you're talking about technology is that there's potential. I shouldn't say potential, actually it's a reality. The reality of it is that tech brings along with it, environmental issues. This is not strictly an environmental discussion, but it does inform this quite a bit. Anybody who's seen the e-waste sites in Ghana, for example, knows this is a very problematic thing about tech. The more tech isn't the answer, that's important to note. So anybody projects is screaming for more and more tech, I think, again, view with some degree of suspicion there. Configuring existing tech, regardless of platform maker model, is a better way forward. So using what exists potentially to provide that access to secondary schools in the Asia Pacific region is much more, environmentally friendly and much more community engaged model than doing these, what we traditionally know as like these tech drops, where you just an outside organization provides X number, thousands of laptops or something like that. E-waste, again, is a very, very significant issue. And again, if you're unfamiliar with these e-waste sites, which again, I should note, are largely littered with not domestic tech. This is, exported tech from places like the UK. I suggest looking it up. Be wary of any tech acquisition programs without the significant parallel work, which I've mentioned a few times already, on teacher training and community engagement. So be wary of those. Anything that's just a tech drop is not a sustainable approach to access by any measure. I know it sounds very like a trope, but you're basically investing in people and connections. I think that's easily overlooked. And this idea of investing in tech strictly as a mechanism to access content, okay, that's part of it. But really what you're doing in investing in people and the connections made possible by the technology. Invest in inclusion for those likely to be marginalized. I think it's very important to note at the onset that any technological access effort will naturally have some cascading effects on what are traditionally already marginalized groups of people. In many cases, that reveals itself along gender lines. In many cases, that might be marginalized parts of the population, such as refugees, internally displaced persons, things of that nature, and definitely along the rural-urban divide that we've been discussing before. So having measures in place at the onset, if you're defining access to secondary schools in a particular way through technology, having a measure in place at the onset to address those divides or to target those already marginalized groups is critical. Important to note, schools can't necessarily do this in and of themselves, right? It should not be seen in isolation. It's a larger effort at digital inclusion around any number of things, really. And this is where you can engage with families. This is where you engage with caregivers and the larger community, is this idea around digital health initiatives or finance initiatives, or the unbanked, the idea of mobile money and things of that nature. Utilities, increasingly you're seeing common utilities being sort of interacted with via digital means, and of course commercial inclusion as well. So that's how you can position, that's how access to education in Asia Pacific via digital can be positioned. It's part of a larger digital inclusion effort. And although very rare, there are livelihoods to be found in these models. You can see an image there from a project, I would believe that was Nepal, a project in Nepal where basically they, you teach women's groups. They're these, informal networks of women throughout the region. You teach them how to repair the technology and use that as a means of livelihood. So they run these kind of small shops essentially to repair this technology. So you can see a virtuous loop in some respect there, that there might be livelihoods and another mechanism for engaging with the community overall towards this idea of access to education. So in sort of wrapping this up now, so access to secondary schools. Now, this is just reiterating some of the points I've already made, but we need to ask what are the barriers to access and whether technology is amplifying or mitigating those. It's a very important question, and it seems perhaps a little bit obvious, but it isn't clear in many cases without a significant amount of scrutiny. Other barriers likely matter more, and I think that's important. I am very much a proponent of digital education. I teach it, I live it, but ultimately I'm aware that education is a much more multifaceted, nuanced issue, and particularly access to that education is very much more that as well. So just remembering that technology doesn't address any underlying social divides or pockets of marginalization. That's very important to note. And we need to consider whether we see the issue of access as to content curriculum or access to teachers and community. Again, that doesn't need to be a binary. We could have both, but are we seeing it as one or the other? Most importantly, are the commercial edtech initiatives positioning it as one or the other? It's very clear when you start looking at their language. It's very clear when you start looking at their imaginaries of what they see education as being and who they want to focus that education on, whether teachers or directly to the students. Language and framing of education certainly matter, and we need to engage with the notion that what works does not scale. This is something that sort of runs counter, I think, to a lot of the policy language and a lot of the strategy documentation. We're looking for these targets and X number of people access to education, or X percentage of groups accessing secondary education. We need to understand that, at least with technology, that what works, and I use quotation marks there because it's kind of a very relative thing, but what works probably doesn't scale because it's so contextually, socioculturally relevant to that particular space that it needs to be, perhaps not completely, it needs to be redefined in other contexts. as well. So often these initiatives never get beyond the piloting stage, and they might be successful in what they've done, but they don't necessarily scale. That's important to note. I think communities need to define this for themselves to some degree. And we need to ensure that the imaginaries of access to secondary school education in the Asia Pacific region are equitable, ethical, sustainable, and contextually specific. Basically what I just said. A few questions, I'll just end with this. A few questions from, again, I'm just going to the well one last time with the Facer and Selwyn work, is that these questions I think can be used to frame the idea of access via digital means in Asia Pacific. How might these technologies interact with the existing social context of education? Who do they marginalize? Well, I'm sort of ad-libbing here a little bit, but who do they marginalize? Who do they inhibit? Who do they privilege? I think those are important questions. How does it change the underlying social or interact with these social dimensions? What assumptions about learning and teaching processes drive these technologies, and what form of learning will therefore be valued or ignored? Really critical question in all educational technology studies, but specifically when we're talking about access. What assumptions do they carry with them? Because those will be amplified very quickly. What evidence is there to support their impact on learning? Hint, very little. And what non-educational consequences might result from these technologies, especially in terms of inequalities, impact on teachers' work, or other ways of altering the character and conditions of education? How do they change the underlying structure of what education is? And how do they impact inequality? How do they impact teachers' work? And I think anybody who lived through last year and had to translate their teaching into online spaces can appreciate the cascading impact on workloads and teachers' work. Engagements with technology rarely take less time. They generally take more in terms of teaching, in terms of learning these systems and making them work meaningfully. So those are the questions I want to end with. I will say that there's some resources here that anybody wants to dig a little bit deeper into in terms of just the data. GSMA, Mobile Telecom Alliance, they do some really good work around that. Internet Society, when we're talking about the community networks. A4AI, which is the Alliance for Affordable Internet, they're doing some good work in the region as well. And of course, the Facer and Selwyn article. And that's it for me. So I'll stop there and see if anybody had any questions they want to ask.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Michael. I want to open up for questions now. Ali, you got your hand up?
Hi, well, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, sorry.
Yep.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much. And well, your presentation makes me wonder about a lot of things. But the first of them, I have two questions. Two questions. The first one is, what is specific or special about secondary education that leads your project? Because from all the information, you could apply all the categories of analysis in your conclusions to any level of education. So it wasn't clear what is special about secondary education, about what is special about secondary education in the context of your project. And a second question is, it is more of a reflexive question. So digital education or technology in education does not improve learning, does not help with workloads of teachers, and it doesn't, it promises more than it does. Why do we still do it? Because I can't, especially after listening, I cannot understand why are we still doing it. So these are my two questions. Thank you.
No, thank you. Those are good questions. I would say in terms of how, I didn't have my video on, I'm sorry. That's kind of rude of me. I'll turn my video on here too. So in terms of how it links specifically to secondary education, I might let actually Will speak to that a little bit more for the project. But I think in terms of access, when you're talking about the technology and the intersection with education, how different is this for secondary access versus primary access versus higher education access? All of it, I would say this is a much, much larger ecosystem that extends beyond all of that. It applies almost uniformly in some respect to schooling or formal education in general. So how specific what I just described was to secondary education, I would say probably nominally so. It's more about like an overall structure about how education is being framed, and how the definitions or how we understand access to be is being structured, through the technology or through the rhetoric. So ultimately, I think in terms of how specifically this relates to secondary education, it really is contextual. I think really my approach here was to suggest that these things are surrounding education. These actors are surrounding education, and they're increasingly structuring how we sort of see education to be. So that's not a great answer to your question, but so I guess the short answer is little, very little. Yeah.
When we think about secondary education, what we already know is that it's poorly funded.
Yeah.
It is key for vocational. It is key for work. So there are a lot of elements that make secondary education a very, very important or a undervalued level of education. So this is why I was wondering, but thank you. And now the second question, because the second question is the one that drives me mad, to be honest.
So again, I think this is an interesting question. It's a question, I mean, I honestly ask myself all the time too. Right? If indeed funding is very sparse, if indeed that initiatives or activity could be better directed at something else, then should it be? And I guess I can say this fairly clearly. I think the answer is yes. I think it should be directed towards other things, if indeed access to secondary education is better served by, physical infrastructure development or teacher training or things of that nature. If it's better served that way, by all means, they should do it. I would say ultimately, though, the question of whether they should do it is sometimes existing at decision points beyond what teachers and schools and control. That a lot of this is sort of being wound up in all of that policy language and the strategy and the report. All of that is sort of being framed at a national or quote unquote global level, and that's eliminating a little bit of the agency that I think schools and districts have in making their own educational decisions about what access should be. So do I think that's a great thing? No, I certainly don't. So I think often that money is better spent elsewhere. I do think, though, that I'm generally not a big fan of these very, very formal, large-scale technology education kinds of projects, or even at the national level. I am a big fan of using existing technology that already exists and using that in a way that enhances existing education, or potentially provide some mechanism for access. So I am a fan of that, and a fan of using technology in a more supplemental kind of way, as opposed to taking up more and more of a small budget, which seems very, very problematic in this respect too. So I think the history of educational technology is, some minor successes amidst a lot of money and a lot of effort, and not always a lot of impact. I will say this, that the one thing that has changed some degree of this discussion is not that COVID will be with us, not the situation will be with us for a long period of time. It's the physical co-location issue that is particularly hard to resist now, I think. And I think that's where educational technology has an advantage, or the commercial actors, I should say, have an advantage in this discussion, just because it's hard to resist the notion of, no, I'm going to resist the technology because and I'm okay with the students not accessing education. So it's a very problematic space, and more often than not, I'm just a big believer in local educational autonomy, an agency to define what's proper and appropriate for them.
Yeah, well, this is why I think that in your project, the idea of the imaginary is key.
Yeah.
I think that is brilliant. But I have more questions, but I'm not going to monopolize.
No
Thank
problem.
you.
It was a good question. Very good question.
Thanks, Ali. Yeah, others with questions? While people are thinking about their next question, I'll just address the secondary education question on this. So Michael's part of this project team, and the project overall looks at access to secondary education in the Asia Pacific region, in part because of the transition towards universal secondary education with SDG 4 relative to primary pieces beforehand. So we're looking at lots of different things here, barriers to access to secondary education over this broad region. About, well, over half of all out-of-school youth from secondary education are in this broader Asia Pacific region. And so we've got case studies coming up on the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Bangladesh, Laos, and who else we're missing?
Philippines? No, you said it.
Yeah. And Mongolia.
Mongolia.
So yeah, and so Michael was asked to come in here because of his expertise on this, and because there's always this sense that, oh, we can solve this issue through technology and digital education. What do you think, Michael? Rightly, at least brings up important questions for us to consider. All right. Other questions? Yeah, Natasha.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Michael. I put it in the chat, but it's probably easier to explain what kind of examples I'm looking for. First of all, I think your talk, I mean, I don't know where to start. It raises so many really important issues. And in terms of like last points you had, I think particularly important one, distinction between access to content versus access to community. And what really worries me, I mean, you said this in the beginning, that it's basically exacerbating issues of access that we know also, regardless of the technology context, but this kind of diminishing the role of institutions and professionals is really worrying in terms of, you know, what it means for, like, they are the equalizing factor in society. So when the institutional boundaries become so blurred and the onus of access is on individuals and families, like students, you know, you are lucky if you are part of one of these initiatives and maybe get a tablet, but like really who's responsible for removing the barrier of access is, in my opinion, it should be institutions. So I agree with you for what it's worth, that really role of teachers and potentially schools as those networks where people, you know, see the school as the place to come to. And the other, you had a point about underlying assumptions. What I find really interesting is how this whole situation really reveals these underlying assumptions that we have generally about what education is for. Like, it seems to be really all about learning. I mean, I don't know the particular context of Asia Pacific, but it was really interesting to follow globally reactions of states. It was just like, quickly do something to make teaching happen, to deliver learning online. And then when you talk to, you know, people, families, students, like, they miss being with their friends, being in the school community. They miss their teacher. So there are no interventions for that. It really tells you what is the underlying assumption about what education is for. And I think that's something that, if you have good examples, I'm asking this because Will and I are working on a report for UNESCO that's trying to articulate like, what is the future of teaching, as, you know, building those communities, and whether they're virtual or real. It would be interesting to say something about this in the context of digital education. So if you have examples, you mentioned examples from Nepal, but I'm just trying to understand what makes them good examples. Like, is it only when you say there are initiatives that focus on helping teachers, is it only developing teachers' pedagogical skill to teach those who have access, or is it more than that? Like, is it reaching out to communities? Because that's where I think there is knowledge about who has access and who might need to be given access. Sorry, that was my point. Is I'm trying to understand where you see these good examples, what makes them good examples, and I'm just thinking of incorporating them in the report we are working on.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to share some over, Natasha, after the presentation. But I think I would sort of evaluate good activities or initiatives as being ones that provide. Again, I'm going to return to the same things I was talking about, but provide that agency for the communities to define these for themselves. Mm-hmm. So the idea of the community network, although it will never scale. So scale is not part of my evaluation criteria necessarily. It's about communities defining for themselves what they want in terms of internet access, building that for themselves, developing a community and a livelihood around that access, and then linking it to inclusion elsewhere. So whether that be education or finance or health or whatever it might be. So I evaluate those projects and programs largely around the idea of agency and how it provides the teacher and the school and the community the capacity to define these things for themselves. Because the idea of secondary access to secondary education or any schooling whatsoever, I think is going to skew differently in different contexts, and everybody needs to feel empowered or capable of making those decisions for themselves. So I view it that way. And I'll share some examples, and I think the community networks are a good example of that. And there are others, and I'm sure I'm going to embarrass him again, but JJ can speak to that a little bit too. He'll be joining us at Moray House very soon. But there are other examples throughout the region of these sorts of things happening. But again, it's about this idea of we're not normalizing, and I think you get this idea of you're normalizing a particular mode of access. We're not doing that. We're populating a pluriverse where multiple modes of access, multiple modes of education are possible, depending on the local context. So you're not trying to normalize any sort of practice. You're actually trying to populate a very diverse array of practices there. And I think empowerment and ownership are really important in that process. The ability to adapt, to discard, to engage with a particular technology or a particular kind of technological structure is very, very critical. And I can point to some examples. There's some on the end of my slides as well, so I think they're worth investigating. They do a lot of local community outreach, community engagement, very, very grassroots type of activity, which is very appreciative.
Okay, thanks. That's what I needed to know, like whether it's pedagogical training of teachers, or is it more than that, like reaching out to community as well?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both for sure. I think the pedagogical bit, I think I emphasized that in part 3 there quite prominently, because I think it does, any kind of engagement with the technology does have spill-on effects into the pedagogy, and that needs to be thought through and redefined, but as part of a larger kind of empowering effort, I think. Just real quick, thanks. Natasha, just to reference a point you mentioned earlier, it's about the rhetoric and the language is so critically important because it's largely, and I think this extends to any kind of educational technology, because it's so unassailable. Who's going to argue against continuity of schooling? Who's going to argue against open education? All right, the ideas of advanced in these models are very, very, very difficult to argue against. And so it becomes this very structuring, accelerating kind of process. So I think the language is really critical to explore. And I think when you start looking at the educational technologies, you go back and you'll see it immediately. You'll see what position of education they're largely advancing based on what they're trying to sell.
Mm.
It's just very difficult to resist.
Thanks. Thank you, Mike.
No worries.
Excellent. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Do you have anybody? Well, Michael, since we don't have, I'm going to take advantage of this time then. I was wondering if you can kind of end a little bit on the future. So you've talked about COVID, and I'm wondering about this momentum. You talked about the imaginaries from digital education, and there's all these different imaginaries coming from commercial actors. And one of the examples you gave were kind of the school in a box or low-fee private schools, and there was this pushback and counter narrative from civil society, including some of our partners from ASPE that are joining us today. Thinking about the imaginaries that are coming out, the momentum from COVID, do you see kind of building counter narratives out there from civil society? What are we in a post-COVID world that really incorporates a lot of what we're seeing now? Just from your own fun experience, tell me our future.
Oh, we got 5 minutes. I could do that. So the counter narratives, I think you would want to see more, for sure. The counter narratives that we're seeing, and I think I was making that case a little bit earlier in the presentation, is that the language from the commercial actors is being echoed into some of the policy targets and some of the language around, what our goals and priorities are. So the language of the ed tech is becoming increasingly the narrative. And so the idea of counter narratives, I think, will begin to appear as a result of this COVID experience. I mean, you're seeing a lot of pushback towards things that might have gone unnoticed before. And I think like a good example of that would be like remote proctoring, technologies, and how I was about to say the word heinous. That's not very academic, but essentially how heinous these things can be in terms of surveillance and collecting student data and this sorts of things. So you're starting to see some counter narrative to that. But I think the counter narrative, honestly, that is becoming more and more, I think, prominent, maybe it's still very kind of grassroots at the moment, are these environmental concerns about educational technology. They're just not largely sustainable as currently envisioned, as these kind of one laptop per child, mass distribution of technology. They're not sustainable in any respect. So that is some of the narrative starting to emerge there too. Aside from that though, not as much as you would hope, but hopefully, again, this COVID experience will start to surface some of those as well.
Thanks. So we have, if you've got time for one last question. So Shika, you've got a question from Shika in the chat box asking about if it's just learning outcomes, or do we have some other goals to achieve with technologies in secondary school?
No, it's a good question, Shika. Thanks for the question. I think the expectations of what the technologies can do in secondary education in terms of learning outcomes are largely framed by national, regional, global kind of indicators and these sorts of things. So yes, you would hope that there is some measurable gain in a learning outcome and some justification for doing it, period. But we've found that largely no. You cannot track learning outcomes divorced from the context in which they appear, even if you're trying to isolate the technological actor and its impact on that. It's very, very elusive, very, very difficult to isolate that one factor. So national policy, strategy, et cetera, are focusing, I would say, predominantly on measurable classroom activities and outcomes. So do I think that is there something beyond that with technology that we're trying to achieve? And I say, yes, it just depends, I think, on what your view of education is, period. Do you see it as, we're achieving particular learning outcomes in preparation for particular progression sequences of students to higher levels of education, in preparation for employment in a larger society? Or do you see it potentially as being, something slightly more than that, a slightly more holistic presentation of what the student is and what we can hope to achieve with that student? Can the technology satisfy potentially a supplemental level of instruction for students to push beyond the learning outcomes, or to push beyond or satisfy their own curiosity about what they want to learn and these sorts of things. So I think there is space for technology outside of formal outcomes, outside of formal learning activity. And in fact, that might be the best space for it. It exists in this supplemental, relevant still educationally, but it's largely a supplemental sort of space. Maybe even in informal spaces, it's much better served than it would be in formal education spaces. Again, this is coming from somebody who teaches exclusively online at this point, who teaches in a digital education program. It sounds like I'm critiquing my own space to death, but I think there's probably better uses of resources in many cases than technology. Thanks for the question, Chika.
Excellent. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our time today. I want to thank you, Michael, for joining us and really having some interesting questions for us to think about where we're at today and where we're going in the future for digital access. So thanks, everybody, for joining us. Thanks, Michael, for your presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.